I'm Jason Herbert, and like a lot of you, I was saddened and shocked this morning when I found out about the passing of Pope Francis. And I say this to you as a guy who is not Catholic. I don't even practice any religion whatsoever, but I always liked what I saw out of Francis. Now, Francis was a human guy, and I'm sure he had his own flaws, but everything I saw out of the man reflected a real love of humanity, a real empathy, a real kindness, a real vow to try to make the world a better place. But I didn't really know him well, and I don't really know Catholicism well, and I certainly don't understand the papacy or anything like that, but I want to. And that's the reason why we have this podcast, is to have these kinds of discussions. So I invited on for you a friend of mine, a friend of this pod, who you know very well by now, Matt Gabriele. He is a professor of medieval studies in the Department of Religion and Culture at Virginia Tech. He studies a lot about religion, violence, nostalgia, the apocalypse, but he also knows a lot, as you're going to hear today, about the history of the Catholic Church, the papacy, the role of the Pope, how it's changed over time, and so forth. So I invited Matt on to kind of flesh out some ideas, maybe put Francis's life into historical context and talk maybe a little bit about the historic role of the Pope as it has changed over time. So for those of you who are interested, I really hope that you enjoyed this podcast. Really enjoyed talking to Matt today. It was a really great discussion about a really great man. And I hope you enjoyed the conversation. So welcome to Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Starts now. It's so weird not to have an agenda on these things. It's also weird not to. Let's go ahead. Let's say it. It's weird that David Perry is not here either. I feel like he's contractually obligated to be on here. So
yeah, we're like toddlers, kind of slowly walking away from each other, from this partnership, right? Like we're starting to suss out how far we can get away from each other. So,
well, as long as you don't do that to this pod, because I think if I check the notes, you guys are due for a pod about every six to 8 weeks anyway.
Yeah,
like you are my safe space where I just every so often was like, okay, Matt and David will be back on. They'll come talk. So,
there's lots of good medieval movies. Sure, yeah.
No shortage of bad ones. We really have to do a bad one at some point.
There's plenty of those. Yeah,
I know. Like we're due, right? Like we should just pick one out and we'll just shit all over it. But that's not the case today. As people who just listened to the introduction that I've yet to record will by now know, Pope Francis died this morning, which you and I were just talking before we started recording.
Yep,
came as a shock, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, day after Easter, how it just appeared, had a long illness, pneumonia, problems in the hospital, came out of it, seemed to be doing okay, gave an Easter message, went through the little Pope-mobile kind of through the crowd at Easter. And then the next morning was gone. This morning was gone.
Yeah. I don't know, man. It kind of seemed... I'm going to try to be actually as serious as I can when I talk about this today, because I know that a lot of people really do put a lot of faith in Francis. I actually really like this guy. I think I'm not a religious guy, but I actually really liked Francis, or at least for everything that I saw out of this guy. So I actually I'm actually trying to be respectful in this conversation about it, because it seems like he went about as peacefully as you could hope to go, right? I mean, it's like a stroke and then heart attack.
Yeah, as far as we can tell. I mean, I'm sure more details will emerge, kind of later on, but he seems to have passed pretty peacefully in his sleep. So, he wasn't young. I mean, so,
88.
88. Like that's a long life. So, and got to be Pope for a while. So,
Yeah.
So I'm a Catholic, so I don't feel. I'm also a Catholic who is the grandchild of a funeral director. So my attitude towards death is probably a little bit different than most people's. But I mean, Bergoglio, who took the name Francis I, had a really kind of long life. Made and I think this is the big thing that people will be talking about. And why I'm so interested in having this conversation is it'll be really interesting to see how long lasting his impact will be, because it could be really he really tried to put the church on a different path, and really what'll matter is who they select next and what'll happen to that legacy.
Yeah. So Matt, I think I actually grew up Southern Baptist, in Kentucky. So we certainly had a lot of Catholic folks in Western Kentucky as well. And I grew up in Louisiana as well. So like there's a heavy amount of that. But I'm not super familiar. I've attended Mass and things like that, but I'm not super familiar with Catholic doctrine or what the Pope is or does or things like that. So I thought, a lot of what we could do today is kind of talk not only about Francis's life, but maybe about the history of the papacy, maybe the differing roles that popes have. We have time to cover every single pope, right?
Yeah, we'll do about an hour on each. We'll be done in no time. Yeah, absolutely.
Good, yeah. Terrific, and that's just the highlights. So yeah, and you and I are about the same age. As I was kind of growing up, it was kind of a John Paul II world.
Absolutely.
That I saw. Yeah. And for me as a child, as a Gen X person, my understanding of what Catholicism was or what the Pope was or that role was always inhabited by him. And then he passed, and then we had Benedict for a shorter time, correct? Mm-hmm. And then for the last 12, 13 years has been Francis?
Yeah, he's been around for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So let's actually start backwards, and let's start with Francis himself. Can we talk a little bit about what his papacy was? What does that's the right word for his time as Pope? Mm-hmm. Can we talk about what you saw out of his term as Pope?
Sure. I mean, one of the big things I think that was coming out of so as you said, I was born in 1975, so most of my childhood, again, I was raised Catholic, and I'm a church historian, so I pay a lot of attention to this kind of stuff, especially because Catholicism has such a strong connection intellectually still, even within kind of contemporary Catholic communities, to the Middle Ages. So yeah, John Paul II kind of was the main pope of kind of my childhood, and most of his life, not exclusively, but he was kind of the pope who kind of opposed communism, was born in Poland, was raised there, really had kind of a real attention towards the Cold War, and then, transitioned to the Benedict. And so the reason I say that is because for most of my upbringing, my understanding and my formation, kind of as a young Catholic, was that it was a very conservative Catholicism, one aligned kind of with the West, very, comfortable, I would say. There's some caveats to that, comfortable with capitalism, but understanding kind of the idea of kind of human freedom and liberty, kind of as opposed to kind of what the Eastern Bloc with the Soviet Union was. And that really kind of continued with Benedict. And there's some interesting kind of differences with Benedict and Francis and with his predecessor, John Paul II as well. But one of the things that Francis did, I mean, coming from the Americas, the first South American Pope from South America, the first Jesuit Pope, which is not an insignificant thing, he really tried to kind of open up the church. And this is kind of there's a saying in kind of church history, both among kind of church historians, but among within the church itself. And that's Ecclesia Semper Reformanda, which is the church is always in need of reform, or the church is always reforming. And the idea behind that is that it's a tradition that stretches back in its own estimation, kind of 2,000 years, but one that has never stayed the same. It's always kind of a little bit different. And one of the things that's always been a tension is, how does it change? Does it kind of man the walls and put stronger kind of perimeters about what Catholicism is, what the church is, and to the detriment of people kind of outside of that? Or does it try to throw open the gates and have a much more expansive understanding of who's eligible within the church's theology, of kind of eligible for salvation, how you treat kind of people who are non-Christians, I mean, Protestants, for example, or Jews or Muslims, or, any other religious tradition. And Francis was very much in that kind of latter category, is very much about understanding how religion was practiced in reality in these different communities, the different life experiences that people would suffer, but also understanding kind of fundamentally, I think, in a different way, is that the structural implications of how people are raised and the way that oppression treats them can lead them to very different places. He is, as my understanding goes, and I'm not a super expert on this, but I've read a number of things. Is like he's revered in Gaza, for example, because he always cares about the Catholic Church in Gaza and the plight of any citizens in Gaza who are suffering under kind of occupation, who are suffering under kind of violence and things like that. that was kind of his role. Like, previous popes had a very different kind of relationship with the Israel-Palestine kind of conflict, but he was very much on the side of kind of understanding how kind of power operated in very specific contexts. His statements about kind of the LGBTQ plus communities was much more opening, much more understanding, never kind of embracing, never kind of going kind of beyond what kind of previous tradition had suggested, like never endorsing kind of ordainment of women or, kind of full integration of the LGBTQ community into the Catholic Church, to a lot of people's consternation, and very understandable in that way. But much more open to conversations and kind of external compassion, talking about compassion and empathy in a way that his predecessors had not. And so I think that's the real tension now, and the real concern is like, well, what happens next, right? Like, because a lot of somebody I was, posting some stuff on Blue Sky earlier, and, the thing that Francis was able, like, the church is a huge thing. It's been around for 2,000 years, and it has a functional bureaucracy. Like, the Vatican is a state. Like, it has a Secretary of State, and it has a bureaucracy, and it has all these kind of functionaries who do the work of the Roman Catholic Church. And so, like, turning that ship of bureaucracy is a very difficult thing. And I think he definitely did in a certain sense. But the bigger thing that somebody pointed out, and I'm going to kind of mercilessly steal this, is that he really changed kind of the vibe, is that he gave kind of permission for Catholicism to be empathetic, to care about different communities, to be more open, to have more dialogue across different kind of lines in ways that his predecessors had not.
Yeah, and I don't think I'm alone in my statements, and I'm sure, Matt, you've probably heard this before when I said that, like, even though I'm not a practicing Catholic or anything like that, I'd always liked Francis, and it was generally a vibe for me, and it was very much rooted in this openness. I think the lack of decadence coming out of is the other thing, right?
Absolutely.
I seem to remember that. Can we speak to like his he had a real love of poverty.
He really did.
Right?
I mean, he took one of those. I mean, that's kind of the three core vows of any kind of religious profession within the Catholic Church are, vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Mm-hmm. And he really took poverty seriously, which is a hard thing to do, right? Like, I mean, the Catholic Church has a lot of bling. Like, you can see that, right? Like, if anybody who's walked into St. Peter's is very easy to see. There was just an article on CNN, for example, just today I was looking at beforehand. It said, traditionally, one of the things they do is they seal the papal apartments with this kind of, traditional kind of red velvet ribbon. And there's like a seal to make sure that nobody kind of disturbs the Pope's thing until the new Pope is inaugurated and is able to take possession of those things. They did that, but Francis didn't live there. He lived in a guest house, like a small apartment kind of over to the side, and, not in these kind of, it's a palazzo in Rome, basically, well, in the Vatican. He decided not to live there. He lived in a much more modest apartment. He took that kind of stuff seriously. Like, there's a reason why, if you Google a picture of John Paul II or Benedict, you will see them kind of kitted out, which in very kind of appropriate clerical garb for the leader of the Catholic Church. Francis is just kind of in a white habit, with the white little cap. And that was an image that he projected, but it was also something that he took very seriously. There were also some fun things, like when he was a cardinal back in Argentina, back then, it's like, there's pictures of him like on public transit, like just kind of riding, the subway, like around Buenos Aires or something like that. Like he was that kind of guy. And it was a performance, but it was real. Like it was kind of in the real sense of performative, in that, like, a display that meant something to people.
You talk about Francis's openness, his real embrace. I seem to recall a certain picture of him really embracing a horribly disfigured man at some point in time. There've just always been things showing the genuine love this human being showed towards other human beings, which I think we can all reckon with. But I'm wondering, Matt, are you aware? Was there pushback at all when Francis comes in? He's got a different direction, a different vibe than Benedict or John Paul II. Do you know of was there a pushback within the sects of the Roman Catholic Church against this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know kind of the kind of ins and outs of his election. But I will say is that, like, the Roman Catholic Church, like any large organization, has factions, right? And there are factions still today. And I think that the conservatives throughout his tenure were never happy with kind of Francis. I mean, there's kind of a famous moment in which I think it was shortly before the pandemic, it might have been 2019 or thereabouts.
Mhm.
There was a huge gathering in Rome, at the Vatican, in which several representatives from different parishes, different bishoprics from all around the world were kind of gathered there. And what was there, and I can't remember the exact name, and I apologize for this, but I do remember there was an icon from the Amazon of an indigenous community, indigenous Catholic community had brought kind of an image of the Virgin Mary, and that was it was conservatives were not happy about this because it wasn't kind of mainstream. There was some kind of what they would call, and this is a hugely kind of loaded term, kind of a syncretic elements, kind of polytheistic or native kind of elements to this image, as well as, or this icon. It was a statue, as well as kind of Catholic ones. Francis welcomed it. The conservatives were really unhappy about it. And one of them actually, like a conservative, I think it was a priest maybe, like stole it and threw it in the Tiber, like destroyed it, at this moment. And that was kind of a huge moment in which, it kind of revealed kind of to outside observers some of the fault lines that are still going on. Like you still have there's a kind of infamous bishop, a Catholic bishop in Tyler, Texas, who just kind of refuses to do what the Pope says. He still performs kind of Latin mass. He's kind of an icon for right-wing media nowadays because he rejects kind of this open understanding of Catholicism. J.D. Vance, the vice president right now, again, a converted Catholic, but his understanding of Catholicism very different. And he has a lot of kind of supporters, within the Catholic hierarchy about returning to these really rigid understanding, theological understanding, and kind of a doctrinaire reading of who is a Catholic, who is not, who is allowed, kind of entrance into heaven, who's allowed to take the sacraments, and who is not. So those things have kind of continued, and I don't think they're new. They're certainly not new. And they've been fighting kind of against Francis kind of this whole time.
There's going to be a lot of conjecture. A lot of people are going to be watching to see what happens, the ins and outs of who gets selected as the new pope. Certainly, even I am interested in this. But you just mentioned, before we get into that process, you just mentioned the idea that there's the bishop in Texas who doesn't want to listen and things like that. Can we actually talk about what the role of Pope is? Because I don't know that it's really well fleshed out, maybe outside of Catholicism.
Yeah.
So for listeners who don't practice that faith or casually interested, can we talk about what does the Pope actually, is he the boss of religion? What does the Pope do?
Yeah, the boss of religion. I kind of like that. So
it's emblazoned on the back of his shirt, on the back of his jacket when he rides his Harley,
That's right, Papa. So all right. So I'm going to I'll give you the medium answer because as a medievalist, this is, right up my alley is to explain kind of the long history of the church. But we're
going to get there.
My students are subjected to that, but I don't need to subject all the listeners to that as well. So the kind of long-ish or the short-ish answer, I should say, is that the Bishop of Rome right now is the head of the Catholic Church. What that means is that there is a functional ecclesiastical hierarchy of church members within the church, which at its point is the Pope. The Pope himself is believes himself to be in the Catholic Church, kind of theologically understands him to be kind of the vicar of God on earth, meaning that he stands in the place of God on earth, that he has kind of the theological backing to make pronouncements that are doctrine, that are true about kind of spiritual matters as they pertain, kind of to everyone generally, but especially to Catholics as well. And then, that hierarchy descends all the way from kind of the cardinals, who are his closest advisors, who are kind of senior leaders within the church. Some of them, all of them have kind of other positions as well. There are things like archbishops who are over bishops, who are over priests, who are over archdeacons, who are deacons, and then, kind of all the way down. The org chart of the Catholic Church would rival anything at any university here, in the United States. So, but the Pope hasn't always been that, and this is where kind of my longish answer gets in, is that originally it's the Bishop of Rome. It's just the Bishop of the city of Rome. It is ideally the heir to St. Peter. And St. Peter has a particular importance among the disciples to Christians, well, to Catholics especially, but to Christians, because Jesus said at one point in the Gospels, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. And so Peter's martyrdom in Rome, his last kind of missionary outpost, kind of cemented his legacy in the imperial city, which was important at that time as well. And so the descendants or the successors to St. Peter's See had a particular importance. In the ancient world, there were 5 what are known as patriarchs. One of them was Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. And they had kind of a hierarchy. Rome was always kind of the first and most important. Constantinople was very important. Alexandria, because it was a city of particular wealth and learning, was always very important. But it's really kind of in the 12th, 13th century that the Bishop of Rome really asserts itself just within Europe first, but then kind of, Christendom-wide as the head of a hierarchy that extends all the way down and all the way up across the entire Mediterranean world, across all of Christendom. And that's a long kind of complicated history, but basically establishes a tradition which, was very contested by kings and emperors and other rulers along the way. But eventually ends up kind of in where we are now, in which he is kind of the Pope is kind of the avatar of Christianity, of Catholicism, kind of within the Roman Catholic Church.
You mentioned earlier Francis's love of, or his embrace of poverty. I know that comes from Francis of Assisi. Dude, I like a lot because of the animals.
Yep.
Is dude the appropriate term for Catholic
I think for
saints?
Francis especially, he is a dude.
Bro?
Francis is a dude,
bro?
yeah.
Okay, he's definitely a dude. He's my dude. I like that dude. Can we talk a little bit about, does this idea of poverty and celibacy and obedience, is this all the way back from Peter? Does this develop over time?
Yeah.
Where do these roles start to change? Because I also have questions about popes as warlords at some point in time.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. So the poverty, chastity, and obedience actually comes from a different strain, because what you have within any sort of living tradition, especially one that does kind of, with bumps, kind of go back a couple thousand years, is there's different kind of strands that are interlocking that kind of created the modern version of what we have, which sometimes pretends that it's been uninterrupted all the way back into antiquity, but is absolutely, as historians, we know things change over time. Poverty, chastity, and obedience specifically are kind of the 3 main tenets of monasticism, of monks, basically. And so all the religious orders, in some way, the Jesuits included, and Francis was a Jesuit among the Jesuit order, which is founded much later in the 16th century. But the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the followers of St. Dominic, the followers of St. Francis, Benedictines, the follower of St. Benedict, a much older order, and then others as well. Their idea being is that poverty, chastity, and obedience comes from giving up the importance of things of this world, the things of the flesh, in order to concentrate on things of the spiritual. And a very, very, very oversimplified idea behind this is, if you think of it kind of as a scale, is that if you give up things of the flesh, you can have time, have more space within yourself for spiritual concentration, for things about, concern about prayer, about your spiritual life. Abstinence allows for sanctity. And this has been kind of a constant tension, because the other side of that, and this goes back to one of the other pods we did, talking about the name of the rose. There was a lively debate in the late Middle Ages, and it goes back into antiquity, and it continues to this day. It's about the ostentation, the wealth of the church. It does have kind of a theological meaning that you glorify God by beauty, by wealth, and the wealth allows you to do things like giving to charity, supporting, those in need and stuff like that. It's just kind of about kind of what balance do you bring? And there have been kind of extremes on one side and the other throughout the church's history. The thing about Francis, though, is that he was very much kind of, I don't want to say he was more Jesuit than Pope, but it gave that vibe, as opposed to kind of his predecessors, in that he was much more concerned about kind of bringing his experience and his previous life within the church into the papacy, rather than kind of be, letting the papacy kind of, not overwhelm him, because that's not the right word, but taking on the trappings of the papacy in many ways. And I think that's why you see, or he was very much concerned about that. There's also too, I mentioned kind of performative in the best way kind of earlier on. And I think Francis was very concerned about kind of optics in kind of modern media, is that the way that he presented himself, the way that he showed himself to the world, he understood the Pope as one of the most photographed, one of the most famous people kind of in the world, regardless of whether you're a Catholic or not. And so he wanted the church to seem in a certain way because it meant something that he cared for a certain type of people versus another type of people. Whether he actually did or not, I mean, that's a separate question or not, but that is absolutely, I think, kind of part of what he was trying to give up. And he could pull on, just as, his predecessors could, and maybe his successor will, a very ancient tradition within that. And that's the thing about kind of, about the Catholic Church, is it has kind of all of this kind of mixed together, a resistance to empire and an embrace of empire, an embrace of poverty and ostentatious wealth that's almost beyond belief at times.
You talk about these ancient traditions, and you and I, both being born in 77 and 75 respectively, are both ancient. My knees are cracking as I wake up in the morning. But I'm wondering, Matt, are there a few popes that are really notable throughout time? And I'm talking, 3, 4, 5 popes that are really, for people that people should really kind of know over time.
I mean, they should know all the popes, Jason.
All the
they
popes,
should
right?
Just memorize them. Yeah, just start with Peter and then count
I'm
forward.
going to hell, but for other reasons too. So,
so there's a couple of specific popes. There's also kind of like we were talking about vibes earlier. There's also kind of papal vibes. So I'm gonna kind of split the difference and talk about a couple of specific popes and a couple of vibes. So my favorite, and I'll just go chronologically because it's the easiest, right? Is that I always like to start when I'm talking about kind of the papacy, is that because it's such a dramatic difference, is that the way, and maybe this made me a medievalist now that I think about this, is that I remember as an undergraduate taking my first medieval history class and learning at some point very early on in the semester about the papal pornocracy. Which is a word that is described as not entirely fair, but it's not entirely unfair to describe the popes, the bishops of Rome in the 10th century. The bishops of Rome in the 10th century were some of the most decadent, kind of delusional, just debauched people you can imagine. And some of it's absolutely hyperbole of kind of the rhetoric of their enemies. But what I mean by that is like people with mistresses, people who, kind of stole wealth, for their own kind of family gain, etc. Because one of the things... Yeah, no, I mean, it's very easy to imagine. I mean, everybody has seen Showtime at some point, right? So they can kind of get the idea. Mm-hmm. But I think what it really is important to remember, or why it's important to kind of think about it is a nice little shorthand for, is because through most of the early Middle Ages is that it was a local office. Meaning that the Bishop of Rome was fought over by Roman aristocrats, in which they tried to instill their preferred candidate, usually a family member, into that position so that they could benefit from the power and the institutional structures that benefited the Bishop of Rome. One of the things that happens in late antiquity is that some of the kind of what we would think of today as kind of quote unquote secular power accrues to bishops, in that when Roman governors kind of disappear, bishops take over those roles. They collect taxes. They try to maintain order within the cities. They have, militias that can support them. They can, issue edicts. They become kind of the figureheads of cities and stuff like that. Rome's a very important city. The Bishop of Rome is a very important kind of figure, regardless of kind of any theological, but it has that extra theological weight to it. And so in the 10th century, you have a lot of these guys are murdered all the time. They are murdering their enemies all the time. They are caught in kind of compromising positions by their enemies, blah, blah, blah. And that really changes very early in the middle of the 11th century with this guy, Leo IX. And I love Leo IX because Leo is kind of an overlooked, if you want to get in on the ground floor of hipster popedom, you're going to talk about Leo IX. Because he's overshadowed by one of his successors, Gregory VII. Because we know this thing in the Middle Ages, the Gregorian reform. But it really starts with Leo. Leo IX is kind of the institutor of this. Leo is a bishop from Germany. He's the bishop of Toul, which is a city. It's a real place in Germany. He's appointed by the emperor at the time, a German emperor, and installed into Rome. And he kind of brings reforming ideas which are taken from monasticism in many ways, about the independence of the church, about kind of freeing it from the vice grip of the Roman aristocracy, about insisting on celibacy, insisting on priests not being able to buy offices, which is called the heresy of simony, after Simon Peter in the Acts of the Apostles, or not Simon Peter, sorry, Simon Magus. Simon Peter is an important person. That's actually Peter. Simon Magus is the other guy. So in kind of starting this reform ball rolling, and in some ways, kind of like Francis, like his successors take him up on that. And that's why it's really carried through. And it reaches it starts to reach one of its zeniths with Gregory VII, and really starts to assert kind of the independence of the papacy as kind of a functional independent hierarchy. The control of the spiritual realm should be divorced from the secular realm. Kings and priests should not be able to appoint bishops. Those are spiritual positions that the Pope should have a say in. And this leads to this huge thing called the investiture controversy, which the popes and emperors fight about for a century or more, even beyond that as well. So Leo IX, papal pornocracy. And then I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. There's some other guys who are really important. Urban II is very important because he launches the First Crusade in 1095, which not only kind of the instantiation, the creation of kind of holy war, or the formalization, I should say, of holy war within Christian tradition at that time. But I'm going to skip ahead to the early 13th century and this guy, Innocent III. Innocent III is an Italian. He reigns from 1198 to 1215, and he is kind of the absolute zenith of papal power. He is, by the time we get to him, and by the force of his personality and by the reforms that he has instituted, by the bureaucracy that has been created around him, he is absolutely, when he gets into a conflict with an emperor or king, he's going to win. And he does, like all the time. He is responsible for launching what becomes the Fourth Crusade, which takes Constantinople from the Byzantine East, installs a Latin king, a Western king in Constantinople, and then launches the Albigensian Crusade against heretics in south of France in 1208, and then calls something incredibly important, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. And the Fourth Lateran Council is I think, a really turning point for the medieval church, because it lays out 99 decrees, which are canons, which are decrees basically. And it's this huge kind of council from people all over Europe. And within those 99 decrees, it does something incredibly, it's a really kind of, it's so fascinating. Like I'm trying to describe it so briefly, because I just like you're in danger of getting an hour-long lecture on this.
Go for it.
But yeah. But the short version is he threads a needle. And what I mean by that is that within the decrees of Lateran IV, he both institutionalizes holy war as an instrument that the Pope, specifically the Pope, can wield against its enemies. That if you defer from the definition of kind of what is a Christian that the Pope has created and or will create in the future, you can be the subject of a crusade. You are excommunicated, but not only that, you are subject to violence, like actual physical violence that people should carry out and are willing to carry out at that moment in the 13th century. But at the same time, within the Canon 1, the first canon, it's so fascinating. I can't remember the exact wording, but it's basically like there is one of the phrases within that is that there's one universal church of the faithful outside of which there's absolutely no salvation, and which entrance can be given by the priest who is duly ordained and is conferred by the rite of baptism. And this does two things: is that it somehow manages to cement the walls. Again, like I mentioned, like the Pope gets to decide who's kind of Christian and who is not. If you are not part of the church, there's no chance of you ever going to heaven. You are outside the realm of salvation. But it makes baptism the entry. It formalizes that baptism is the entry, meaning that anyone can join. And this is a new thing, because in the early Middle Ages especially, there was a real tension about churchmen. Okay, they can go to heaven. Nobles, especially if they participate in holy war, they can probably go to heaven. Everybody else, which is the vast majority of the population, peasants, merchants, people like that, what about them? And that led to a lot of tension. And what Lateran IV does is it gives them an in. It's a really restricted in, but it formalizes a way into the community in which Innocent is kind of saying, and the whole church kind of adopts. And then the subsequent decrees kind of lay out, like, This means that every churchman has a responsibility to every parishioner, every person in its community, that they cannot charge them for the sacraments, that they should be educated, and they should know how to perform the mass so that everybody who's eligible can get into heaven. It has the sacraments performed to them properly. Like it's like almost quality control. So it's doing this weird thing in which it's creating this incredibly restrictive and violent Christianity, but it's also saying, like, at the same time, like, yeah, everybody can be part of this. So I find that really particularly interesting about Innocent III is that he's kind of he is the first one, not the first one, but he is one who you can really see some of these streams of all of these ideas that are percolating for centuries, even a millennium and more, kind of finally coming together in one way. It's not, guaranteed that it would have come together in that way, but it does there. So Innocent III is kind of like, if we're kind of tracing an arc towards Francis, like Innocent III is like this big, different kind of important moment along the way. From there, I would skip ahead, and I wouldn't say necessarily kind of one pope in particular, but the Second Vatican Council, which happens in the early 1960s. It meets from 1962 to 1965. This is a huge reform movement in the church. This is where the Latin Mass is kind of put to the side, and the Mass can be performed in any language. This is new in the 1960s. This is the first time ever that the Mass doesn't need to be performed in Latin. And lots of other kind of liberalizing reforms. And I would say that Francis and his predecessors are fighting about that legacy, even back 60 plus years. One of the things about, Benedict XVI, like a very conservative member of the tradition, Francis is a very kind of a break from that. Both of them were participants in, Benedict XVI was a participant in Vatican II, but sort of became kind of a little bit more conservative along the way. And, who gets to choose what the legacy of the Second Vatican Council is really kind of up in the air now.
I actually want to ask you, we just recently had a pod where we were talking about the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which for people that should know, it's really from the 1960s forward up until 1998, a period of incredible sectarian and religious violence. I'm kind of wondering, have we seen... what's the stance now of, say, Catholicism or the Pope towards other denominations within maybe what we would call a larger Christian church? Yeah. Does Catholicism accept, say, Methodists as Christians, or what is there a stance here?
That is a really good question, and I think I think there's an answer. I don't know the answer to that. Okay. And one of the reasons that I say that is because tradition evolves. Yeah. And I'm thinking back, for example, to John Paul II. And early on, during was it? Now I'm questioning myself. It was John Paul or it was Benedict. Anyway, at some point earlier on, there was in early, I think it was in the early 2000s. I think it was in 2004. So whoever was Pope then, and I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. I would look at Wikipedia, but I don't want to interrupt myself. Anyway, is that
the Pope?
There was not Pope. Yeah, exactly. There was a formal apology to the Greek Orthodox for the Fourth Crusade, which occurred in 1204. Meaning that there were very kind of conscious attempts and throughout the entire 21st century to kind of reconcile some of those differences. And there were moments, and I can't remember exactly, there was even kind of theological conversations between the Catholic Church and Lutherans about kind of very specific doctrinal differences in which they kind of came to a sort of understanding. I don't want to misrepresent it, say that there was reconciliation or anything like that, because the Catholics still think of themselves as different and the Lutherans still think of themselves as different and stuff like that. But I think there's more kind of what's known as kind of ecumenism, right? Is like a sense that the Christian denominations have more in common than they have difference among not just kind of Francis, but among his predecessors as well.
I want to ask you, you're talking about Leo and Urban and Innocent and all of these guys, Francis and John Paul, and all of these men, I'm assuming, Matt, are of European descent all the way up until we get to say, Francis. Argentinian? Am I correct?
He's from Argentina. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So here's my question, and I'm wondering that what we don't see, and if I recall from my teachings early on, is that the early Christian church, Ethiopia was a very strong hotbed. I think you know where I'm going with this. We've seen Caucasian men as head of the church. Is there a chance? Is there a movement to diversify that? Is that openly discussed? And do you think maybe Francis being from the Americas has maybe opened that door to where we see a non-white pope? And do you think is that possible?
Well, I mean, the the largest number of Catholics in the world are not in Europe anymore. I'll tell you that. So whether that means that you will have a pope from Africa or another pope from Latin America or pope from Asia, that's a possibility. Again, I think it depends what the church, what the cardinalate, like the people who select, who actually kind of elect the pope, how they see Francis's legacy, like in what direction do they want to move? Because this would be a hugely important and a hugely symbolic gesture as well, in order to elect someone who's not from Europe again, because as you said, the vast majority of popes have been from Europe. The vast majority have been from Italy specifically.
Right.
Vast majority have been from Italy specifically. So it's really hard to say right now. Like I have not, because everything is very, very fresh. I have not seen kind of who are the kind of front runners and stuff like that, who are the main kind of power players. One of the things that happens oftentimes is that, keen observers understand like who were the previous popes, the now deceased popes, like closest advisors, who's closely set up to perhaps be a successor or not. And I'm just not aware of kind of how things are leaning. I mean, I never thought, until 2008 that the United States in my lifetime would elect an African-American president. So I wouldn't say that anything is out of the realm of possibility. But I just don't know that the cardinalate, which is pretty conservative generally, would move in that direction.
I think possible that they might just try to reel back in a little bit. It's like, okay, we stepped outside the boundaries here. We'll kind of over time maybe broaden the horizon. It's been a while. Benedict was where was he? Was not from.
He was German,
right? And then
member of the Nazi youth party.
Yeah,
in fact.
Yeah. That's a whole other discussion we didn't get into. Which is,
he was a child, but yeah.
Right. John Paul was Polish.
John Paul was Polish.
Been a decades since we've had a Roman pope.
Yep. No, absolutely.
So it's entirely possible. But here's my question. What I know next is that I look for a chimney. Turning red. And the closest thing I know about this happening was back when John Calipari became coach of the Kentucky Wildcats several years ago. We were all watching for a blue chimney out in the Commonwealth. Calipari is famously Catholic as well. What happens? Like, what's the process of selecting a pope?
Sure.
Do they need to run a zone defense versus man to man? Like, what happens next?
I think really, it's important that you don't allow whoever the closest successor is to get too much penetration, too close to the papal throne. So you want to play kind of deny, you want to keep them on the outside,
right?
If they're gonna make them beat you from the outside. So one of the fascinating things, and this is I'm stealing again. We were joking about kind of me not being allowed to be too far away from David. And so I will summon him back into this conversation, because one of the things that, he is very fond of saying, and he's absolutely right about, is that medieval people loved electing things. They loved democratic processes. Mm-hmm. And this is one of those things. Popes have always been elected. They're always elected. Sometimes, those elections are more free than others. And now, is kind of no different. But the way that the next pope would be elected is through something called a conclave. And there is a really excellent kind of lovely movie.
We're watching it this week.
Recently came out. Yeah, it's so good. It's not like, it's a movie. Like it has elements of truth and it doesn't, of course.
Right.
But anyway, the basic kind of threads of it are that all the cardinals, and the cardinals are appointees who are special kind of counselors to the Pope. The College of Cardinals was instituted in the Middle Ages as kind of building a bureaucracy so the Pope wouldn't be dependent upon secular rulers for things like notaries and scribes and messengers and stuff like that. That was one of the reasons that this was started. But then it's evolved into kind of a very formal thing. Most of the cardinals live in Rome and are kind of part of the Vatican entourage, but there are cardinals kind of all over the place. There's cardinals in the United States, there's cardinals in Asia and kind of all over the place. They will gather. Everyone who's an appointed cardinal will gather in Rome in the Sistine Chapel, in which they will cast ballots for who they think should be the Pope. There is kind of both formal and informal politicking, of course, that's happening. Both people who, it's not very humble, of course, and you don't want your Pope to be kind of prideful, to campaign for it yourself. But, you have supporters who are campaigning for you. I think there are probably powerful people who have built constituencies along the way who will have kind of more or less formal people kind of effectively kind of suggesting, whispering people's ear, who are you going to support and stuff like that. But basically, it's by secret ballot, is that they vote until somebody gets a clear majority. It might be a 2/3 majority. I can't remember exactly right now. And they just they vote several times per day. They pray on it. They take meals together, but they're kind of sheltered from the outside world. So no one can ideally interfere in this process. It's an entirely contained thing. And that's why the smoke, right, is so important, is when a certain color smoke emerges from the chimney, they have made, their choice. But that's the only communication that people are allowed, the cardinals are allowed to have with the outside world. But again, this is a process that began kind of in the later Middle Ages and continues kind of through today, with some modifications and stuff like that. But it's voting, it's electing their new leader.
Yeah. I think regardless of whether or not you are a believer or a practitioner or anything like that, I think there's certainly an interest in, I think certainly for people like myself, and I think for yourself, Matt, like there's a genuine hope here, is that whoever this choice is that they're good people, right? I mean, that's my base, because boy, Francis, I'm sure he certainly was a human as well. I'm sure he had his own whatever, but
yeah,
I guess that's what I'm hoping for as far as an outsider looking in on this, is like, man, I saw this guy doing a lot of real good stuff and really appreciated him just as a person. And I'm really sad to see him go, but I'm really glad that I got to see him do his thing,
Yeah. And I mean, the Catholic Church has a very troubled legacy. I mean, let's be clear. Like, it is not fully reckoned with the child sexual abuse scandal. Like, absolutely not. I mean, I think Francis made some good moves in the right direction about, in various ways, but like it still hasn't fully reckoned with that. And that's just the most recent thing, like, let alone like all the other kind of stuff going on. But I think you're right. Like, the thing about the papacy is that although it's the head of the Catholic Church, or the big boss, as you said, of the religion, Americans tend to live in this idea that religion and politics are not intimately intertwined in almost every way, and the papacy kind of puts that lie out in the open, because he is the head of a state, but also the head of a religious tradition. He is someone who the heads of state of any Western nation, any nation around the world, kind of cares about and has to kind of contend with. There's a reason J.D. Vance, our current vice president, went to the Vatican in the days before. There's a reason why Francis decided not to meet with him and have him lectured on compassion. Before he ultimately met with Vance. But those things matter, right? Like he spoke out against kind of illegal detentions. I mentioned on Blue Sky earlier today, I was, I went to visit my parents this weekend, who live in South Carolina. We went to a Catholic mass for Easter because they wanted to, and we wanted to be, good house guests. And the priest there, one of the first prayers that was offered was for all those unjustly imprisoned, right? Which was that's a vibe, right? That's a vibe that the church can bring that is implemented on a local level. And I don't know what the congregation, the people who are listening to that in that packed church were hearing. But like, I understood what was going on there. And so you want people who want to teach empathy and compassion and to bring a little bit more of that into the world, regardless of kind of any other consideration.
Yeah, I think that's maybe the perfect way to wrap this up. I think whenever I think on this guy, it's empathy and compassion. I hope we get another one. So here's hoping.
Yeah.
Awesome. Matt, this was a really short notice for me to put you on the spot and ask you to come on. I was like, hey, you want to come on tonight?
Yeah.
So forth. So I really appreciate you taking the time. I'm sure other people have been asking you a bunch of questions today and so
My
forth.
pleasure.
So thank you for tending to the flock today.
Such as it was. Yeah.
My pleasure.
Always happy to join you, Jason.
Awesome, brother.